The defining moment for One Shot arrives about a minute in, as main character Nico sits down at a computer and bears witness to a one-sided conversation not directed at them in particular. The actual intended recipient of the message becomes clear when the game launches a distinct pop-up window that pulls name data from the player's PC to give a very apt title drop. Or at least, it was apt in the original 2014 version of the game, where closing or resetting the window would execute code on the save data, rendering the software effectively unplayable, meaning you only have one shot to save the world by carrying the lightbulb sun to the end of the game. In the commercial remake, though, various factors likely incentivize the developers to cut this feature, alluding to it but allowing the player to continue on anyway. The fact that you had one sitting to complete each section of the game was considered such a central element of its identity that it was literally the namesake, which might seem odd for a remake to remove. But you could say the core appeal of One Shot is not the punishment for closing the game window, but instead an aspect maintained in between versions. And the overarching element this mechanic is contained within, the fact that the game addresses the player and the software so directly. That's not to say One Shot lacks merit outside of its peculiar gimmick. Saving in-depth detail for later, the game's presentation is absolutely top-notch, with enchantingly beautiful environments and wonderfully cartoony expressive character designs. The simple, calming soundtrack evokes the iconic and beloved musical style of Yume Nikki and its various fan games, which I assume is intentional, serving as a perfect accompaniment for the contemplative stroll throughout each area. But when we talk about the actual gameplay, and what in particular makes the game unique and exciting, I'm sure few people intimately remember something like the kindling puzzle that comes right after the computer. It's the kind of adequately competent item puzzle you could expect to find in any game in this little subgenre. Being so archetypal, it's practically identical to something in Chapter 1 of Corpse Party. On the other hand, I'd wager most who played this game still recall with wonderment the safe code puzzle, where the game creates a text file with the answer in your documents and eludes the information existing outside of the game world with a pop-up window. These moments not only stand out within the genre, but also within One Shot, probably because of the game's general format. Each major area is a series of item puzzles connected through what feels like a complicated web of branches and steps. And once or twice in the middle of all this, you'll be greeted with a pop-up window indicating something outside the software as a necessary hint to make progress. The pop-up window is a very useful bit of UI to indicate when the player has to look outside the game window. These puzzles can be difficult as they extend the possibility space to literally your entire computer, and knowing that you only have to go looking when you've been given a clear direction can help keep you on track. The pace and context of the gameplay is provided by a variety of cutscenes, placed in between these marks of progress. And then each individual area is bookended by the game forcing Nico to bed, which forcibly closes the game window, allowing and incentivizing the player to take a break. And when the game is reopened, Nico will begin a discussion with the player where they're given dialogue options of how to respond. There are moments where Nico will address the player outside of this, either referencing them while speaking to an NPC or directing a short remark towards them, but most of the time the player isn't given opportunity to express a response outside of a bedside chat. There's quite a unique feeling to these conversations, even on just the conceptual level. A lot of the time when I'm playing a game and taking it seriously, I'll constrain my own decisions to some imagined morality of the setting, or to the characterization of the protagonist, however I may have interpreted them. But One Shot takes away my ability to do so, by distinguishing the protagonist and player, and by separating the player from the setting. It's as if it's asking me to simply be honest, to be myself, and arguably that I decide to play a role does indicate something about me as a person, but there's much less abstraction to it. I think it's worth putting into words what exactly One Shot is doing, because while this game and many others even vaguely similar to it are grouped together under the label of metafiction, I feel that such a term is far too broad. That could refer to commentary of medium, genre, artist, audience, or the work itself, taking the form of loose metaphor or direct statement. But One Shot is doing something very specific in the way it plays around with the fourth wall. The identification of the fourth wall as a concept is attributed to the writing of Denis Diderot, describing an invisible wall separating the stage from the audience that a performer must imagine in order to behave as if there is no audience at all. Or, to borrow the phrasing of fellow YouTuber Andrew Cunningham, the fourth wall is pretending that the fictional world is real and the real world doesn't exist. Something done not just by live performers, but also most works of fiction. Though perhaps a bit of an anachronistic designation, breaking the fourth wall by addressing the audience is quite an old concept in theatre, from Greek choruses to Shakespearean soliloquy. This sort of thing was primarily done in order to communicate or reveal information directly to the audience, a feature which can also be found in the fourth wall breaks of other newer mediums. After all, most video games constantly undermine their own constructed reality in order to acknowledge and explain the mechanics for the player's benefit, even those generally quite committed to unbroken verisimilitude. However, still, within narrative moments, breaking the fourth wall is more the exception than the rule, I'd say. Even in, for example, Earthbound, the common ancestor to games like OneShot, the fourth wall breaks featured in that game are surprisingly transient, never dwelled upon or explained beyond their application. This is despite the fourth wall breaks occurring frequently and even occasionally being quite pivotal to the story. But the narrative otherwise attempts to play on with sincerity, as if the fact that it is fictional is irrelevant or unworthy of serious attention. Despite these fourth wall breaks being ostensibly banal in this regard, Earthbound is one of the earliest examples of the ways in which a video game breaking the fourth wall can be different than any other medium. For you see, a pre-recorded or pre-scripted work can be standardized, but the audience can't really do anything to interact with this. A live performance can have someone on stage interact with a member of the audience, but that experience cannot be standardized, in that any interaction with an audience member is unique to them and is not interactive for any other audience member, even if they were in attendance. Being a chiefly interactive medium, though, video games can provide both interactivity and standardization. This of course applies even to moments where the game breaks the fourth wall. No matter the person or setting, halfway through the game, Earthbound will ask you, the player, to type in your real name. And just as well, OneShot will do the same, about 10 minutes in, only if it wasn't right the first time. I suppose this, too, is part of what separates OneShot from most works in any medium that apply some pressure to the fourth wall. OneShot is a game that ties acknowledgement of the player's reality and the hardware upon which they engage with the software into its plot and gameplay. Rather than breaking the fourth wall transiently or for humor, this is heavily integrated into a narrative built upon stakes and sincerity. It would feel wrong to say that the game is creating a character whose only trait is interacting with the fictional world through software for the actual player to take on the role, but another way to phrase it might be to say that OneShot never once pretends that the real world of the player does not exist. Something relatively rare for the technique of breaking the fourth wall, especially at the time. Which is to say, I know for certain that heavily narratively integrated standardized interactive fourth wall breaks are not something exclusive to OneShot. It might be one of the oldest, but only a year later we see OneShot succeeded by the much more popular Undertale, a game in which characters reflect some awareness of the player's ability to save and reload. The mainstream success of Undertale not only spawned a wave of metafictional indies, but also opened the doorway for earlier titles to see a bit of spotlight, including OneShot. In fact, the 2016 version of OneShot had parts of its extra story altered in order to avoid treading the same ground as a certain other meta-based game. In a way, we could consider OneShot both an important stepping stone in this phenomenon, but also work in conversation with Undertale's concepts, trying to add its own unique ideas. It is a bit difficult to discuss OneShot coherently what were the differences between the two iterations. The 2016 version can hardly claim to be revolutionary in its form, but the 2014 version simply feels much less polished and complete. While the earlier iteration did originate much of the material, in many areas it's far more difficult to discern what the game is trying to communicate with the inclusion of such elements. Even in the newer versions, the themes of the piece feel incomplete without going through the content added in OneShot Solstice. Still, some of OneShot's most impressive qualities can be found within its original iteration, most essentially the fourth wall breaking software puzzles that I've been harping on about. I might argue it's even more impressive to see this in what is essentially a slightly modified version of RPG Maker 2003. Now, I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but I feel strongly enough to declare that any analysis that doesn't hold some regard for OneShot's innovations on the puzzle mechanics would have to be one that doesn't hold any regard for game design as an artistic medium in its own right, nor for the artistry to be admired in the craftsmanship of programming. And in that case, it would be odd to analyze a computer game in the first place. If, for the medium of video games, early 3D titles and VR pioneers could be compared to the invention of new instruments for the medium of music, OneShot's puzzles feel like the refinement for the foundations of a new style or genre. I say refinement rather than establishment because I might be taking a bit too much credit away from works like 1998's Metal Gear Solid, a major inspiration for OneShot which dabbled in a couple such antics, limited though it may have been by being on a console, or 2012's I'm Scared, which had an ultimately simpler and much more limited integration of such puzzles than OneShot. Even having this context, OneShot feels as if it's going much further with its capabilities than simply hiding a bit of text somewhere else. And moreover, it codifies disparate elements from across the history of the medium into a definitive form. Though these puzzles are simple and sparse, the game presents them with enough focus, enough pomp and circumstance to come across as important. And, in my opinion, they lay a solid groundwork that any future game can observe and build upon. Although many may find newer games more impressive, one might argue something just as admirable as iteration upon an existing concept is giving solidity to the concept in the first place. Even then, the 2016 version honed the mechanical elements of the original game even further. I think the most disappointing moment in the original one-shot is the maze section of its ending, which just presents a Lost Forest-style puzzle with the item UI. Despite being intended as the climactic challenge, it doesn't really play to any strength of the game. Even the use of the UI doesn't technically break the fourth wall, as it could be an abstraction of Nico's perspective rather than one unique to the player. The 2016 version of this final maze instead requires the player to align two different windows in order to find the path forward. It feels quite striking that the tattered letters are both a framing device for the solutions they provide, and that the information conveyed within them is also a reward for each bit of progress. Good stuff. For moments like this, and for the general commonality of cutscenes in the game, I must admit it's understandable to put more attention on the narrative of OneShot. Though perhaps less revolutionary for the form, it's generally quite charming, and deals with various interconnected topics in such a way that untangling the web of meaning might take more mental power than solving the game's challenges. The setting also pairs very well with the mechanics in such a way that switching between discussion on one or the other feels quite natural. Most video games use narrative to justify or reinforce their agential mode, and many, particularly those deriving from the tradition of visual novels, feature some narrative interactivity. It's not all too unique that OneShot does both, but it is interesting that when it breaks the fourth wall, these moments relate both to narrative and mechanics. By definition, the fourth wall is a concept in storytelling rather than in gameplay, but not only are these moments a display of programming the player interacts with, but they're often framing for or elaboration of the puzzle mechanics the player engages with. Because of that, I sort of have an assumption I'll share with you. It's easy to imagine the narrative premise came after the mechanical premise. If one were to create a game centered around puzzles and exploration typical to its genre, occasionally featuring puzzles that extend outside the software, the idea of a fictional world that acknowledges the player's real computer feels almost like the only logical conclusion. The two layers of the fictional world relate to the two distinct types of mechanical interaction the player partakes in. Nico's layer houses the normal puzzles, and the layer above that is where you do the software puzzles. At the very least, there's only so much compartmentalization that a player can do before the dissonance of a work consistently breaking the fourth wall but refusing to dwell on it can flood one's mind on the matter. I personally think, for these reasons, and some more I'll go over later, the construction of the game really lends itself to mechanical analysis being at least as important as narrative analysis, even in the remake, which has much more story content. Regardless of version, the one moment that remains identical between both is the choice the player must make at the ending. Shortly before arriving at the end, the player is informed that their two goals of saving the world and letting Nico return home are at odds. This whole time, the possibility of the sun shattering and dooming the world has been presented as a small danger to consider, but the player is informed that shattering the sun is the only way to let Nico return home. Additionally, it is indicated that when the sun is returned to its position, Nico will die. With the exception of one character who implies that the world may be doomed regardless, everyone has desired the return of the sun, with a few people even helping them along, so it may seem unthinkable not to fulfill this goal at the end. At the same time, the player's conversations with Nico have revolved around their home and their life. It's been the goal in the background before Nico even found the sun in the first place. The relationship between Nico and the player is the most consistent and developed throughout the piece, with the interactive conversations prompting a sort of parasocial bond between the two. And, well, Nico is intended to be quite a charming character, bearing a very cute and stylish design, being brave and good-hearted in a way that makes him admirable, but also simple-minded and childish in a way that might evoke a protective instinct. But what I find most effective about this dilemma is that, despite what harsher critics might say, this works regardless of the player's investment in the fiction. If you really like the world of the game and or Nico as a character, then there's an emotional motivation and possibly an internal conflict you might have over choosing one over the other. But even if you've concluded you feel nothing over anyone, you still have to make the choice. You must consider what is the better option. I'd wager that most people don't have any particular attachment to the faceless individuals presented in the numerous variations of the trolley problem, but that's not necessary for it to be an intellectually engaging thought experiment. Regardless of whether or not OneShot succeeds in complicating the issue through additional investment, the question it asks of the player at the ending is still there. Do you save this dying world and kill the innocent Nico in the process, or doom the world and let Nico return home? If you remove the potential emotional investment, though, it might be fair to say that this ethical dilemma is disconnected from the rest of the game. It's not as if the rest of the game really explores morality, as every act of kindness enacted by Nico is either necessary for story progress or dissimilar to the quandary presented at the end. I suppose the optional quest to help regrow the seed of the plant lady does technically relate to saving the world, as this action is effectively pointless without restoring the sun, but it's not really a dilemma on what's the better option. The only thing you lose if you take time to improve the world you leave behind is a small bit of time that you might not know is even wasted at this point. I might say the 2016 version alleviates this problem along with many others. issues. But instead of wasting any more time litigating what was already present in one iteration and simply highlighted by minor changes, versus what was added wholesale, I'll just talk about everything all at once now. While the Steam page clarifies OneShot is not a horror game, there's still a lot of subtle horror elements in the setting. There's a tangible gloominess about the world, with many of the roadblocks or area gates being a product of decay or disrepair, if that wasn't already clear from any bit of optional area design. Every major area has some blocked off or abandoned section, contextualized through some past or current destruction. The game depicts a litany of low light settings, and even putting aside that the sun is literally a light bulb, everything is only visible through the presence of artificial light. Aside from flame and technology, a lot of the light is produced from bioluminescence, a trait shared by every non-ram animal you can find in the game. As the game later clarifies, the wildlife Nico encountered have all specifically evolved for the conditions of a world without sunlight, which is to say, even nature is adjusting the best it can to the world's demise. The end of the world is technically not inevitable, though it being saved would quite literally be a miracle, but it's undoubtedly in a terrible state. To an extent, it may be evocative of our own world's ecological disasters. And also quite like our current world, the different stages in OneShot depict a very clear class distinction. In the final area, some characters actually own large buildings, but even the lowly workers hold the privilege of living in a city so safe it's literally called the Refuge. Those in the Glen lack the luxuries of upper-class life, burdened by the worries of crops and land dwindling ever further from the ravages of natural and unnatural disaster. But even these conditions are better than those of the Barrens, where the residents endure hard labor and awful conditions, working around noxious fumes and sleeping in packed, confined spaces without amenities. But that's perhaps a bit misleading, as the residents of the Barrens are all robots. They're not only unaffected by the fumes, it actually removes their rust, and presumably sleeping isn't much of an issue. Many of the random refuge residents own robots, but although some robots toil around the Glen, none of them are near other people, the game implying none are owned locally. And of course, there's no one in the Barrens to own another robot besides other robots. These robots are, in a sense, an underclass. Now, though I feel these allusions are clear in the work, I would also say the decay and destruction of the world and the touches upon class commentary are in some ways not thoroughly explored. OneShot may be a reinforcement of Green Critique, but it's not really explaining the concept to a new audience or providing perspective to a familiar one. But I don't consider these things too unimportant to mention because the world's demise and the feelings of the machine underclass are heavily tied to a much more essential theme: the nature of computers, games, and fiction. I will say there is a bit of an awkward construction to these themes, in that not all the major characters of each area contribute to them equally. Calamus and Alula provide endearing interactions with the protagonist and present a representative snapshot of the lower class and the conditions of life in the Glen, but they've nothing to do with computers. The Lamplighter and George likewise represent their own positions and circumstances, but both feel relatively underdeveloped. The most interesting of the major characters by far has to be Silver, the only sentient robot found in the base game. The way that Silver is depicted is very interesting. She appears much more human than the other robots and displays a broader base of knowledge and skill in communication than the specialized droids who struggle to do anything besides what they are programmed for. In hindsight, this is obviously an indication of her sentience, but you might not even realize that she is a robot at first because of it. Perhaps the second most interesting way the game displays her sentience is by having her show a self-destructive impulse of telling Nico that the world basically isn't worth saving, considering that she's basically considered a non-person confined to the darkest, most terrible edges of the world. That she'd consider it a lost cause is understandable, but because she's the only sentient character experiencing such a fate, she's the only character in the base game who acts nearly as pessimistic. What is perhaps even more interesting, though, is her association with chess. From Wolfgang von Kempelen's Mechanical Turk to Xu Fengsheng's Deep Blue, robotics and chess have an intertwined history, one particularly tied to the definitions and limits of artificial intelligence. When Silver clarifies that she can't play chess with any of the other robots, the game is implicitly connecting the state of being sentient and the act of playing chess, or being sentient and playing games. The game of chess happens in the first place as repayment for Nico taking an item from Silver in a scene that also acts as an indication of sentience. That Silver has an emotional attachment to the pendant is very human, pointed out as irrational in the face of her programming. In that way, it's also similar to gaming. The Sutian definition of a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. An animal only interested in survival, or a robot only acting out its programming, would have no need nor desire for such a thing. I think it would fit very well for the metafiction of OneShot, which I believe was derived from its mechanics, to draw such a connection. If we look elsewhere throughout the major characters, we can see a reinforcement of games as a theme expressed through connection to traditional games. Silver plays chess, a game hundreds of years old. George's head is a die, a tool tool used for playing games invented before recorded history. Even Calamus searching for Alula could be compared to two children playing hide-and-seek, a game from time immemorial. It could be said that OneShot draws from such old games to suggest that sentience and play are deeply interconnected, a conception of homo ludens, as it were. The one hole I might poke into this interpretation is that Silver mentions she was specifically programmed to play chess, which sort of undermines any interpretation that it specifically indicates her sentience. There are a few odd little writing issues in the game among the list of small things that mildly mess with a more interesting pattern. For as much credit as I can give the game for its establishment of tone and elaboration of theme, it's a bit hard to say it has a careful attention to detail when an issue like this would be fixed by changing literally just one box of dialogue. I would like to say that OneShot Solstice, the additional post-game route added in an update, is an improvement, but to me it feels like a lateral move. It's quite different from the base game in that the player is mostly just walking around and watching cutscenes. The branching puzzles that made up most of the runtime are truncated to a selection of roughly 2 per area, most of which feel heavily telegraphed. It wasn't exactly rocket science to give the wandering bargainer an item obtained from a Sokoban minigame one room westward, but now you literally just have to walk up and receive the key item. Even the exploration feels minimized, with the game largely reusing areas the player has already seen, but now much more restrictive, and the new areas being completely linear. Cutting down on the quantity of puzzles could have been a great tool to focus further on the fourth wall-breaking ones, providing a concentrated dose of what makes OneShot unique, but instead there are only 2, one at the beginning and one at the end. Decent though they are, there's a clear missed potential here. This is effectively regressing to the level of the 2014 version. In a way, I can understand the logic that the Solstice route being premised on desiring a perfectly happy ending to the narrative would shift its focus primarily to narrative. However, for most of this video, I've been positing the game mechanics are not only at least equally important, but also heavily intertwined with the narrative. And even if you do only care about the storytelling, the state of being intertwined means OneShot devaluing its gameplay in favor of the narrative inherently weakens the narrative. The connection of playing a game and being sentient can only feel less prominent in the mind of the audience when there's less of a game to be played, which feels like an unforced error. And despite there being much less gameplay, the runtime of the Solstice route is comparable to that of the base game, due to the amount of time spent in cutscenes. I do have to complain that some of this feels like unnecessary bloat. Moments like counting down the exact percentage of a loading time, or Nico wondering aloud if the patch of vines is safe to walk on, walking upon them, and then confirming their safety feels like padding a word count. And maybe I wouldn't have noticed the comparative lack of gameplay if the whole thing went by much faster. Regardless, I can admit that in this route, OneShot Solstice feels like it really figured out what it wants to say. The scattered concepts of the original game are shaved down, and the statements the work wants to make are clearer than ever. Here, in the Solstice route, the story explores a commentary on fiction, primarily through metaphors relating to robots. It is revealed the world of the game is a simulation, apparently held together by some combination of the player's computer and Nico's presence. The artificial intelligence controlling the simulation, called the world machine or the entity, has corrupted from its perceived endangering of Nico, destroying parts of the world and facilitating the dilemma at the end of the base game. The whole explanation of this is very complicated and particular, as the writing tries to make a very specific commentary that applies both to the artificial intelligence of the simulation and the understanding of them as fictional characters. The story has alluded to taming as a process that can make a normal robot become sentient, and here it clarifies this act as engaging in suspension of disbelief, to genuinely treat something fake as if it were real. The climax of this route comes when Nico is able to tame the world machine itself, allowing them to immediately access a perfect ending, which takes place on the literal credits. There is a lot that I like about the direction and concept here. The famed Turing test is an imitation game, one where for the robot to win, it must convincingly appear to be human. Though OneShot presents taming as a magical process, it is kind of true that the sentience of robots is something we can only determine through observations of belief. Around a decade after the release of OneShot, the Turing test itself has drawn more skepticism, in an area where algorithms which are not widely considered to be sentient have nonetheless won imitation games a surprising amount of time. Getting into all of that might be a bit complicated for this video though, so I'll leave it off by saying these ideas feel relevant even now. On a more mixed subject, I don't think the existence of the Solstice route as an unconditionally superior outcome makes the choice at the ending of the base game uninteresting by itself. You still experience that in the moment, and the recontextualization of it being a balance between simulated lives and the lives of one person is still a real dilemma, but it certainly feels lessened as the centerpiece, closing out the original game by instead making it an unfortunate twist in the middle. I think in a way though, it still plays to the strengths of OneShot to premise this final route on the player's investment on both the world and Nico. But I think the ultimate conclusion it comes to feels oddly vapid. Fictional things matter if we place value in them, but yeah, that's obvious. It should be to anyone who has any investment in art generally, especially anyone playing One-Shot Solstice in particular, as surely the only people who would endure a second playthrough that's 80% cutscenes already feels an investment in fiction, already believes in its value. It's not exactly presenting a new perspective, and although there's certainly value in putting words to a widely held sentiment, it feels weird for One-Shot to end off on simple affirmation. The rest of One-Shot displays disturbing beauty with its audio-visual design, challenges the player with innovative mechanics, subtly explores various, possibly controversial themes in its narrative. The story page has to clarify it's not a horror game even though it will induce paranoia. The ending being all, it's good that you cared about the characters, just feels a little dissonant, a bit heavy-handed. Were this a more interesting ending, I might argue One-Shot has earned an over-sentimental happy outcome, that it's earned pride in itself, earned the goodwill to be blunt. But it feels wrong for the culmination of a work not to carry on its best, most unique qualities. And I feel that One-Shot is sort of missing something. It feels like it's not attempting to describe the value of fiction in any concrete terms, nor is it presenting the alternative as a negative. And this is where we return to the shadow cast by Undertale. I can't claim to understand the inner workings of the decision. All I know is that lacking whatever topic was dropped in order to avoid overlap with Undertale, One-Shot is left feeling inadequate as a standalone work. There's no attempt to credit or defer to another work that would invite whatever special understanding the player is meant to have. It's just not there. The odd thing is, though, although I think the game's self-reflection is shallow in a vacuum, and this seems to be the primary focus of at least this route, I'd say a lot of what it does feels effective in supporting other aspects of the work. Not only does it coalesce much of the commentary by mixing metaphors of fiction and robotics, I think this whole excursion only highlights what I went on about before, that the traits of Nico are built to evoke empathy. On top of everything else, the Solstice route adds that Nico is operating in a fictional world. Nico is able to return to their normal life without suffering consequences, with the death of the world or the death of Nico themselves being undone, all with Nico retaining some memory and fully regaining it in the Solstice route. In this way, Nico is in a similar situation to that of the player, which this route solidifies. Throughout all this talk about Nico being real and the world being fake, the game actually subtly crafts an argument that it doesn't really matter if Nico is truly just as fictional as everything else. I feel like that's the one message that comes out clear and solid through all the other metafictional commentary. Throughout the making of this video, I've really gone back and forth on how I feel about this game. A lot of it is genuinely interesting, but the story is messy, confused, and it's lacking part of the point it wants to make. It displays and seems to want to convey the beauty and truth revealed by game mechanics, but then minimizes them during what is intended to be its grand final act. But when the game's final area consists of sprites resembling screenshots, abstractions of the journey the player has taken with Nico, and when the entity that the player is ostensibly meant to feel for appears as a literal reflection of Nico, well, it feels hard to deny that, despite everything, One-Shot shows an understanding of its own appeal.